Do you like nice, jolly, happy, uplifting fairy tales? Where the girl gets the guy gets the girl, and it all turns out all right in the end? Then Hans Christian Andersen is not for you! I'll start with a familiar example. You all know the story of the Little Mermaid, right? Where she falls in love with this prince and gets a potion to become human, and he falls in love with her and they get married and it's all kittens and sparkles. That is not what happened, okay? This is Hans Christian Andersen. People are gonna suffer. For a start, the mermaid's attraction isn't portrayed as a positive thing. It's a tragic affliction, and the cure is no better. The potion gives her legs and the ability to walk and even dance gracefully, but every step feels like she's walking on sharp knife blades, and the transformation itself really hurts. Also, the sea witch cuts off her tongue. The rest of that scene in the Disney version is actually pretty accurate to the original fairy tale. The mermaid is all like, "But what will I do without my voice?" And the sea witch is just like, "You're still cute, ain't ya?" I think a lot of people would be surprised at how accurate in some details Disney actually is. After I started reading fairy tales, particularly the oldest versions that I could find, I was surprised to see some things that they'd used. I was like, that really happened? I thought Disney made that up for the kicks. I mean, not for kicks, but like, you know what I mean. For example, the witch does have a garden of grabby polyps outside her house. So the mermaid finds the prince, and he takes her in, and he likes her but doesn't love her, and he marries some princess he thinks is a temple maiden that saved him. And her sisters try to get her to kill the prince before the wedding night, because that'll break the spell, but she can't do it, and she dies, becoming foam on the sea. In the original version, it ends there, but that was too sad even for back then, I guess, so an extra bit was added later where she becomes an air spirit for 300 years before she gets an eternal soul. Mermaids don't have souls, by the way. That's kind of half the whole point of the story, but these days is treated as a trivial detail in the retellings. I've used The Little Mermaid as an example because it's the one people are most familiar with, but you find the same patterns in the majority of his stories. The two main things are, 1, someone is gonna die, and 2, love never works out. Someone always dies. I'd be sat there reading in bed. I read his whole collection, a story or a couple of stories a night, and there'd be a point in every story where it's all like, and they're dead, because of course they are. And my partner was just like, who died now? My partner just got used to my hands-induced rages. It's just like, what did he do now? This is the guy who wrote The Little Match Girl, which is just wall-to-wall sad. There's 2 stories where the main character is a tree, and in both of those, the tree dies. And the second thing is that love never works out. The Little Mermaid is not the only example of this. Either one person doesn't tell the other because they're too shy or busy or a woman, and then they move away and one of them dies, or they do get together and then one of them dies. I can't remember where I learned this, but he was bi and he fell for several men and women, but none of them liked him back. This might be why perhaps love is this tragic, unattainable thing in his stories, rather than the all-healing, powerful force that we're used to portraying it as today. I'm not saying that's bad, just some variety would have been nice, Hans. He even wrote a story specifically calling out Cupid as a butt face. He was not happy with Cupid. You want to look up The Naughty Boy for that one. Unlike the other famous fairy tale authors, like the Brothers Grimm and Asbjørnsen and Moe, Hans wrote the stories himself rather than collecting them, which offers a very interesting insight into Danish life and just human life at the time, and it's really interesting to see silly little things, or even not so silly things, that haven't changed. He was born in 1805 and died 1875, so not that long ago in human history, but honestly 1975 seems like a different country to me, and I was born in the 80s. There's a story about utilizing steam power to fly all over Europe and seeing all of Europe in a day, and a bunch of spices in a cupboard arguing about who's the rarest and most precious based on how infrequently they're taken out of the cupboard and used. I do use my herbs and spices in my spice drawer, and I still have jars of spice that I never use. My parents have a spice drawer with a bunch of spices they don't use. Everyone seems to have one of these. Quite possibly my favorite of these is the Galoshes of Fortune, which I always automatically retitle the Lucky Wellies in my head, which is not correct. Fortune is a fairy, and she leaves these galoshes deliberately in a cloakroom for humans to find, and anyone who puts them on will find themselves transported or transformed into whatever or whoever they want to be. There's a clerk who wishes he was a poet, but finds himself with writer's block, and a bunch of rejection letters in his pocket. Another guy wishes he was traveling, only to find himself in a bumpy, uncomfortable coach, failing to fall asleep and uncomfortable, cramped, and constantly anxiously checking for his passport and his tickets. I've never ridden in a stagecoach, but I've definitely been there. Again, with the writer's or artist's block and the rejection letters, I've been there. This is one of the reasons that I love old-timey literature. You see, so much has changed, and yet also these things that have stayed the same. Being that they're not old folk tales, they are grounded much more in reality and common situations more often than other fairy tale collections. I do remember being shocked at one of the stories that did buck the everyone dies and no one ever gets to fall in love and not die trend that stood out to me. It was called The Happy Family, and I read that title and I said out loud to my partner, "This will end in fire." And then it didn't. The happy family in question were a bunch of snails living in the backyard of a mansion where a veritable forest of docks was growing, and the story was all about how the docks had been planted specifically for the snails because they were edible snails. It's explained, but don't worry, nothing happens. Literally nothing. The two happy snails get married, and everyone was fine. I was in shock. I can only hope that Hans had a happier time than the gloomy outcome of his love story suggests. I complain about all the death and stuff, but this was the Victorian era. The mortality rate was stupidly high, especially for children. The average life expectancy was something stupid like 36, and that was because that children were dying so very often. It does often happen in his stories that someone has lost at least one or even multiple children. So everyone and everything dying and having a tragic end was probably a reflection of Hans' experience, the same way our writing reflects our own experience of the world. If you are looking for something a bit different in the fairy tale genre to read, Hans is your guy. Just don't expect to feel all mushy and happy afterwards. Just talking a little bit about why I've drawn the mermaid the way that I have. I was trying to draw her as accurately to the description as I could. When I originally was looking for descriptions, I read that her skin was like a fresh rose leaf, and I sort of assumed that meant that she was green, which is why you'll see that the mermaids are green in my Little Mermaid short that I did. But later on, it repeatedly describes her hands as white. I didn't really want to do her a human sort of white. I wanted her to look a bit off, so I made it more sort of a grey porcelain type white. I gave her brown hair because I thought that's probably an underused mermaid hair color. Her eyes are specifically described as a deep blue, and what you can see on her tail there, the royal mermaids wear 8 oysters on their tail to show their rank, except for the queen mother who wears 12 because she is like the most high status. This is listed as her only fault that she wears too many oysters. If only that was the only fault of some of our leaders. They wear too many oysters. Anyway, you know. Her garden is described. Her sisters have quite elaborate gardens. The princesses all have their own little garden to take care of. but she has a garden that's just a little round circle of red flowers, and beside that she plants what's described as a pink weeping willow, and she does actually have a little statue of a human boy that does look like the prince. That's a thing that happened in the story. It's described that everything under there has a blue tint to it, like the Twilight movie, and it did describe the sand as violet, but I tried it and it looked really weird, so I went with a more realistic grey color, and I did put a blue tint over everything in the end. I decided it doesn't describe the color of her tail, it just says she has a fishtail, so I just thought, well, they're normally like a silvery, like if I think of a fish, I think it's silvery grey color, so I just did it grey, plus that went with her skin. I was going to put the palace on there. The palace is described as made of coral with amber windows, and the roofs are made of mussel shells, but I didn't really, I guess I could have, but I was just like, nah. Have a good day, nerds.